The Great Hall of the Galactic Council was the largest room ever built by any species in the known universe. It stretched for miles in every direction. The ceiling was so high that clouds formed inside it. Thousands of seats rose in circles around a central platform, and in those seats sat the representatives of over 800 different alien species. Thomas Blake stood near the center, wearing his simple gray suit. He was the ambassador from Earth, a planet that had only joined the galactic community 300 years ago. That was nothing compared to species that had traveled to stars for millions of years. Thomas was 42 years old. He had gray eyes and brown hair that was starting to turn white at the edges. He kept his hands folded behind his back and watched the other delegates with polite interest. Something strange was happening today. Thomas could feel it in the air. The alien species were not looking at each other. They were looking at him. Some of them quickly turned away when he noticed. Others stared with eyes that held emotions Thomas could not name. Fear, respect, something close to terror. He did not understand why. The elder, Representative Vorn, rose from his seat. Vorn belonged to the Crystalline Dominion, a species made entirely of living crystal. His body was tall and thin, shaped like a human but made of blue and purple glass. When he moved, light bent around him in strange ways. He was over 12,000 years old and was considered one of the wisest beings in the galaxy. Today, his crystal body was shaking. "I call this council to order," Vorn said. His voice was like wind chimes in a storm. "I have a request to make. A request that has not been made in 12,000 cycles." The hall went completely silent. Thomas looked around. Several species had stopped breathing. Others had closed their eyes. A few were quietly leaving their seats and moving toward the exits. "I request," Vorn continued, "access to the Forbidden's archive." The reaction was immediate. Screams erupted from a dozen different sections. A species that looked like floating jellyfish began flashing red with alarm. The representatives from the hegemony, a proud warrior race with 4 arms and scaled skin, actually stood up and backed away from the central platform. Thomas leaned toward his aide, a young woman named Rachel Torres. She was 28, with dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. She had been working with Thomas for 3 years and had never seen anything like this. "What is the Forbidden's archive?" Thomas whispered. Rachel shook her head. "I don't know. It's not in any of our records." Vorn raised one crystalline arm and the hall slowly returned to order. Not peace, just order. The fear remained. "I know this is difficult," Vorn said. "I know what I am asking. But there are new delegates here. Young species. They have forgotten the old warnings. They have begun to ask questions. Questions about the elder races who disappeared. Questions about the Void Reapers who suddenly retreated. Questions about the consumption fleet that turned back at the edge of the Orion Arm." He paused and looked directly at Thomas Blake. Questions about the humans. Thomas felt every eye in the room turn toward him. The weight of those stares was almost physical. He straightened his back and kept his face calm, even though his heart was beating fast. "What do humans have to do with any of this?" Thomas asked. Vorn made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. "Everything, Ambassador Blake. Your species has everything to do with this. And it is time the galaxy remembered why." He gestured with one arm, and the air in the center of the hall began to shimmer. A holographic projector activated, casting light into a 3-dimensional display. At first it showed only darkness and stars. Then it showed Earth. Thomas recognized his home planet immediately. The blue oceans, the green and brown continents, the white swirls of clouds. But this was not the Earth he knew. The timestamp on the recording showed a date 312 years in the past. This was Earth during first contact. We received this transmission from a long-range observation probe, Vorn explained. It was sent by a species called the Watchers. They no longer exist. They chose to end their own civilization rather than continue living with what they had witnessed. The image shifted. It showed a fleet of ships approaching Earth. Millions of ships. Each one was massive and organic, like a living creature made of black flesh and bone. They moved through space like a swarm of insects, blocking out the stars wherever they went. The Devourers, someone whispered in the audience. The word spread like a disease. Species began to weep. Others simply closed their eyes and waited. Yes, Vorn said. The Devourers. The consumption fleet. The greatest threat the galaxy had ever known. They had eaten 600 worlds. Trillions upon trillions of lives. No species had ever stopped them. No weapon had ever harmed them. They came to Earth expecting another meal. The hologram showed the Devourer fleet entering Earth's solar system. It showed the tiny blue planet waiting in their path. It showed no defenses, no fleet, nothing but a primitive species that had only recently learned to leave their own atmosphere. What we witnessed next, Vorn said quietly, changed everything. The image shifted again. This time, it showed a single photograph. A human woman. She had brown hair with streaks of gray. Her face was round and soft, with deep wrinkles around her eyes and mouth. She wore a simple dress with flowers printed on it. She was smiling, the kind of warm and gentle smile that grandmothers gave to their grandchildren. She looked completely ordinary. The moment her image appeared, 17 species fled the hall. They did not walk. They ran. Representatives who had faced wars and disasters and the death of stars ran screaming from the image of an old human woman in a flower dress. Thomas stared in complete confusion. Who is that? Vorn's crystalline body was shaking so hard that pieces of him were starting to crack. Her name, he said, and his voice was barely a whisper, was Margaret Wells. The humans called her Grandma Maggie. That's my great-great-grandmother, Thomas said slowly. He remembered seeing that exact photograph in his family's old albums. She was a schoolteacher. She retired before I was born. She made the best apple pie in her county. She also, Vorn said, single-handedly destroyed the Devourer Armada. Not with weapons. Not with technology. With something far worse. Thomas waited. With kindness, Vorn finished. With patience. With hospitality. Your great-great-grandmother, Ambassador Blake, broke a galaxy-consuming horror with pot roasting conversation. And the universe has never been the same since. The hall was silent. Thomas looked at the image of Margaret Wells. She looked back at him with her gentle smile, frozen in time, completely unaware that her name would one day make entire civilizations tremble with fear. I think, Thomas said slowly, you need to start from the beginning. Vorn nodded. Yes, I think we do. And Ambassador Blake? I suggest you sit down. What you are about to learn will change everything you thought you knew about your species. Thomas sat. Rachel sat beside him, and the Forbidden's archive began to open its secrets. The lights in the great hall dimmed as the Forbidden's archive opened. Holographic images floated in the air, showing documents and recordings that had been sealed away for thousands of years. Thomas Blake watched with growing unease as file after file appeared around him. Most of the files were damaged. Large sections had been burned away or corrupted beyond repair. Some looked like they had been deliberately destroyed. But enough remained to tell a story that Thomas had never heard before. Vorn's crystalline voice filled the silence. What you are about to see are testimonies. Recordings made by species who witnessed humanity's first war. Most of these species no longer exist. Some went extinct naturally. Others chose to end themselves. A few simply vanished, leaving no trace behind. But before they disappeared, they left these warnings. The first recording activated. It showed a creature that looked like a mixture of a fish and a bird, with silver scales and feathered wings. It sat in a dark room, speaking directly into a camera. Its voice was high and musical, but there was a tremor in it that spoke of deep fear. "I am Fleet Commander Rix of the Hegemony Naval Forces," the creature said. "I am recording this testimony because I do not expect to live much longer. What I witnessed at the planet called Earth has broken something inside me. I cannot sleep. I cannot eat. I can only remember." Thomas leaned forward in his seat. Rachel was recording everything on a small device, her hand shaking slightly. "When we first detected the humans," Commander Rix continued, "we thought they were nothing. Just another primitive species crawling around on a small rock. They had only recently discovered fire compared to us. They had never left their own solar system. They were carbon-based, short-lived, and soft. We estimated their military capability at less than 0. The recording showed images of early Earth, cities filled with buildings made of glass and steel, vehicles moving along roads, airplanes crossing the sky. Compared to the vast fleets of the galaxy, it looked like a child's toy set. When the Devourers came, Commander Rix said, we expected to simply wait. Let the Devourers consume Earth, then harvest whatever scraps remained. That was the plan. That was always the plan. The Devourers would thin out the weak species, and we would profit from the leftovers. His voice dropped lower. We were fools. The hologram shifted to show the Devourer fleet arriving in Earth's solar system. Millions of organic ships, each one larger than a city. They moved with terrible purpose, surrounding the small blue planet like a swarm of locusts preparing to feed. The Devourers sent their standard message, Commander Rix explained. They always did. It was a formality. They told the humans that resistance was pointless, that their world would be consumed, that their species would end. They gave the humans one standard cycle to prepare for death. Thomas knew what was coming. He could feel it in his bones. But nothing could have prepared him for what he saw next. The humans did not run, Commander Rix said. They did not hide. They did not surrender. In one standard cycle, while the Devourers waited, the humans built 17 interstellar warships. The hologram showed it happening. Factories working at impossible speeds. People working day and night without rest. Materials being gathered from every corner of the planet. Ships taking shape in a matter of hours, not years. Impossible, Rachel whispered. We didn't have that technology. We didn't have the resources. How did they do it? Vorn answered her question. Your species has a quality that we do not fully understand. You call it many things. Determination, stubbornness, spite. When humans are told that something cannot be done, they do it anyway. Not because they have a plan. Not because they have the means. Simply because someone told them no. Commander Rix's testimony continued. The ships were crude, barely functional. They should not have been able to fly, let alone fight. But the humans flew them anyway. They attacked the Devourer fleet with weapons made from kitchen knives and construction equipment. They rammed their ships into the enemy. They sacrificed themselves by the thousands. The recording showed the battle. Human ships, small and fragile, throwing themselves at the massive Devourer vessels. Explosions lit up the darkness of space. Human pilots died screaming, but more came to take their place. It was not a victory, Commander Rix said. The humans lost 90% of their fleet in the first hour. They could not win. Everyone knew that. But they would not stop. They kept fighting. They kept dying. And something strange began to happen. He paused, and his feathered face showed something that looked like confusion. The Devourers became afraid, not of the human weapons. not of the human ships. They were afraid of the humans themselves, of creatures who would throw themselves into certain death with smiles on their faces, of a species that treated extinction as an inconvenience rather than an ending. Thomas thought about human history, about all the wars his species had fought, about all the times they had been told to give up and had refused. He was beginning to understand why the aliens looked at him with such fear. But the battle was not what ended the war, Commander Rick said. The battle was just a distraction. While the humans died in space, something else was happening on the surface. Something that would change the galaxy forever. The recording shifted to show the planet Earth, a small farmhouse in a flat region covered with fields of wheat, a wooden fence, a dirt road, an old woman standing on the porch, watching the sky burn with the light of Battle. Margaret Wells. She refused to evacuate, Commander Ricks explained. The military tried to force her. She hit a soldier with a wooden spoon and told him to mind his manners. When they tried again, she organized the other civilians into a resistance. But that was not the worst of it. His voice became very quiet. The worst of it was the invitation. Thomas did not understand. What invitation? Vorn answered. Your great-great-grandmother, Ambassador Blake, sent a message to the Devourer Hive Queen. A direct communication to the leader of a species that had consumed 600 worlds. She invited it to dinner. The hall was completely silent. Even the species who had remained in their seats seemed frozen with shock. The Hive Queen accepted, Vorn continued. No one knows why. Perhaps it was curious. Perhaps it was bored. Perhaps it simply wanted to meet the creature that dared to speak to it as an equal. Whatever the reason, the Hive Queen descended to Earth. It landed its ship in a wheat field. It walked to the farmhouse of Margaret Wells. The hologram showed the Hive Queen. It was massive, larger than a building, with a body made of black chitin and a face full of teeth. It had 100 eyes and 1,000 legs. It was the nightmare of every species in the galaxy. It knocked on Margaret Wells' door, and she opened it with a smile. Sit down, dear, she said in the recording, her voice warm and gentle. You look hungry. I just made pot roast. Commander Ricks's final words echoed through the hall. What happened next is why I can no longer sleep. What happened next is why the Devourers retreated and never returned. What happened next is why every species in the galaxy fears the name Margaret Wells. The recording ended. Thomas sat in his seat, his mind racing with questions. Beside him, Rachel looked like she might be sick. What happened? Thomas asked. What did she do? Vorn's crystalline body flickered with ancient pain. She fed it dinner. She showed it photographs. She talked to it for 7 hours. And by the end, Ambassador Blake, the greatest horror the galaxy had ever known, was crying like a lost child. Thomas stared at the frozen image of his great-great-grandmother, standing in her kitchen with a pot roast in her hands. For the first time, he understood why the galaxy trembled at the mention of her name. The Devourer Hive Queen had lived for 10,000 years. It had let it swarm across the galaxy, consuming world after world. Trillions of lives had ended in its jaws. It had tasted the flesh of 1,000 species. It had never known fear, because there was nothing in the universe that could threaten it, until the night it met Margaret Wells. The Hive Queen descended to Earth in a small shuttle craft. The battle still raged in orbit above, but the Queen did not care about the battle. It was already won. The humans would die. Their planet would be consumed. This dinner invitation was simply a curiosity, a brief entertainment before the feeding began. The shuttle landed in a field of golden wheat. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. The Hive Queen unfolded its massive body and stepped onto the alien soil. It smelled the air and tasted the life energy of billions of humans, waiting to be devoured. The farmhouse stood at the end of a dirt road. It was small and white, with a red roof and a wooden porch. Flowers grew in boxes beneath the windows. A rocking chair sat empty by the front door. The Hive Queen approached. Its 100 eyes scanned for threats. It found none. Just an old human woman standing in the doorway, wiping her hands on an apron. Margaret Wells was 73 years old. She had white hair tied back in a bun. She wore a flower print dress and comfortable shoes. She looked like exactly what she was. A retired schoolteacher and grandmother who spent her days baking pies and tending her garden. She smiled at the Hive Queen as if it were a neighbor coming over for tea. "There you are," she said. "I was starting to worry you got lost. Come in, come in. Dinner's almost ready." The Hive Queen did not move. It stared at this tiny creature with its 1,000 eyes, trying to understand. Was this a trap? A trick? Some kind of weapon in disguise? "Well, don't just stand there," Margaret said. "You're letting the heat out. Come inside and sit down." She turned and walked back into the house, leaving the door open behind her. The Hive Queen followed. The inside of the farmhouse was warm and bright. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace. Photographs covered every wall, showing generations of the Wells family. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all smiling at the camera. A wooden table sat in the center of the main room, covered with a checkered cloth. Margaret Wells was in the kitchen, pulling a large dish from the oven. The smell of cooked meat and vegetables filled the air. She set the dish on the table and began cutting slices. "I hope you like pot roast," she said. "It's my grandmother's recipe. Been in the family for 200 years. The Hive Queen stood in the doorway, its massive body barely fitting in the small space. It did not understand what was happening. This was not how prey behaved. Prey ran. Prey screamed. Prey begged for mercy. They did not offer dinner. "Sit down, dear," Margaret said, gesturing to a chair that was obviously far too small for the Queen's body. "You must be tired after such a long trip." "You know what I am," the Hive Queen said. Its voice was like 1,000 insects speaking at once. "You know why I have come?" "Of course I do." Margaret set a plate in front of the empty chair. "You're here to eat everyone on my planet. Very rude, if you ask me. But my mother always taught me that you should never turn away a hungry guest, no matter how bad their manners are." She sat down across from the Queen and began eating her own dinner as if nothing was wrong. The Hive Queen made a decision. It would consume this creature now. This strange, fearless human who dared to treat the greatest predator in the galaxy like an ordinary visitor. It opened its jaws, revealing rows of teeth designed to tear through metal and stone. It lunged. Margaret Wells did not move. She continued cutting her pot roast into neat pieces, lifting her fork to her mouth, chewing slowly. The Hive Queen's jaws closed on empty air. It tried again, and again, and again. Each time, its teeth passed through the old woman as if she were made of smoke. But she was solid. She was real. The Queen could feel her presence, taste her life energy. It simply could not consume her. "Now stop that," Margaret said firmly, still eating her dinner. "We don't bite at the table. If you're hungry, there's plenty of food right here." The Queen summoned its guards. 3 massive Devourer soldiers materialized inside the farmhouse, their claws ready to tear the human apart. They attacked from all sides. They failed. Their claws passed through Margaret Wells without leaving a mark. She looked up at them with the disappointed expression of a teacher dealing with misbehaving students. "I said stop," she repeated. Her voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that made the soldiers freeze. "You are guests in my home. You will behave like guests, or you will leave. Is that clear?" The soldiers looked at their Queen. The Queen stared at Margaret Wells. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Hive Queen did not know what to do. "Now sit down," Margaret said. "All of you. There's enough pot roast for everyone." The Devour soldiers sat. They did not fit in the chairs. They looked ridiculous, massive creatures of death and destruction squeezed around a grandmother's dinner table. But they sat that the Hive Queen sat as well. "That's better," Margaret said. She stood up and began serving plates to her new guests. "Now, let's have a proper conversation. My name is Margaret Wells. My friends call me Maggie. What should I call you?" The Queen had never been asked its name. In 10,000 years, no one had ever treated it as anything but a monster. It found itself answering before it could stop itself. "I am called the voice of the endless hunger." "That's nice, dear, but I'm not calling you that at the dinner table. Too formal. How about Vicky? You look like a Vicky." The Hive Queen, destroyer of worlds, consumer of civilizations, was now called Vicky. Margaret continued talking. She told stories about her children and grandchildren. She showed photographs from the walls, explaining each one in detail. She talked about her late husband Robert, who had died 10 years ago from a bad heart. She talked about the weather and the crops and the new bakery that had opened in town. The Hive Queen listened. It had no choice. There was something about Margaret Wells that demanded attention. Something that made the Queen feel small and young and strangely vulnerable. "You know," Margaret said after an hour, "my grandson Michael is having trouble in school. He keeps getting into fights. Reminds me of you, actually." "Me?" The Queen said. "Yes, you. Going around consuming planets, hurting people. That's just acting out, isn't it? Something made you angry a long time ago, and you've been taking it out on the universe ever since." The Queen wanted to argue. It wanted to say that it was born to consume, that hunger was its nature, that it knew nothing else. But something stopped it. Something in the old woman's eyes. "What happened to you, Vicky?" Margaret asked gently. "What hurt you so badly that you decided to hurt everyone else?" The Hive Queen felt something it had never felt before. A warmth behind its eyes. A tightness in its chest. A strange water forming in its 100 eyes. It was crying. "I don't remember," the Queen whispered. "It was so long ago. I was young. My nest was destroyed. My family was consumed by another swarm. I was the only one left. I swore I would never be hungry again. Never be weak. Never be prey." Margaret reached across the table and put her hand on one of the Queen's massive claws. The touch was warm and soft. "I'm sorry that happened to you," Margaret said. "But hurting others won't heal that wound, dear. It just makes more wounds in more hearts." They talked for 7 hours. By the end, the Hive Queen was weeping openly, pouring out 10,000 years of pain and loneliness to a human grandmother who listened without judgment. Margaret Wells held the monster's claw and let it cry. When dawn broke over Kansas, the Hive Queen stood up. Its eyes were clear. Its voice was different. "I am going now," it said. "I will call back my swarm. We will leave this place and never return." "Good," Margaret said. "And Vicky? If you ever need someone to talk to, you know where to find me." The Devourers left Earth that day. They have never consumed another world since. The greatest threat the galaxy had ever known was defeated by an old woman with a pot roast and the courage to ask a monster what was wrong. That is the terror of humanity. That is why the galaxy fears them. Not because they fight, because they care. Thomas Blake walked out of the Great Hall. He needed air. He needed space. He needed to understand what he had just learned about his own family. The observation deck of the Galactic Council Station was a long hallway with windows that stretched from floor to ceiling. Stars filled the view in every direction. Countless points of light against the endless black of space. Thomas stood with his hands pressed against the cold glass, staring at nothing. His great-great-grandmother had defeated the Devourers. Not with guns or bombs or armies. With pot roast and kindness. With patience and compassion. She had made a galaxy-destroying monster cry by asking it about its feelings. And somehow, that was more terrifying than any weapon ever created. Rachel Torres found him there 20 minutes later. She was carrying a data tablet filled with files from the Forbidden's archive. Her face was pale and her hands were shaking, but there was also a strange light in her eyes. The light of discovery. The light of understanding. "It gets worse," she said. Thomas laughed, but there was no humor in it. "How can it possibly get worse?" Rachel held up the tablet. "I've been reading the other files. The ones the Council tried to hide. Sir, the Devourers weren't the only species that humans destroyed. We've done it over and over again. Every major threat in galactic history that has encountered humanity has been changed." Thomas turned to face her. "Changed how?" "The Void Reapers," Rachel said, scrolling through her tablet. "They were a religious cult that worshipped death and destruction. They traveled the galaxy in massive ships, burning planets as offerings to their dark gods. No one could stop them. Their faith made them fearless. They welcomed death because they believed it would bring them closer to their masters." "I've heard of them," Thomas said. "They're mentioned in some of the old histories. They supposedly vanished thousands of years ago." "They didn't vanish, sir. They disbanded. A human mechanic named Dave Richardson got captured by one of their ships. He was supposed to be a sacrifice. Instead, he spent 3 days telling them jokes." Thomas stared at her. "Jokes?" "Bathroom jokes," Rachel clarified. "Dirty limericks. Puns about bodily functions." The Void Reapers had no concept of humor. Their entire philosophy was built on the idea that existence was suffering and death was the only release. Dave Richardson introduced them to the concept that suffering could be funny. She showed him a recording on her tablet. It showed a massive alien priest, dressed in robes of shadow and bone, laughing uncontrollably while a scruffy human man made faces and told jokes about toilets. The laughter spread through their psychic network, Rachel explained. Within a week, half the Void Reapers had experienced what they called the Great Questioning. They couldn't take themselves seriously anymore. Their faith collapsed. They disbanded their fleet and scattered across the galaxy, searching for more jokes. Thomas rubbed his temples. "That's insane." "That's humans," Rachel said. "And it gets better. The elder races, the ancient species that supposedly disappeared millions of years ago, leaving behind only ruins and mysteries. What about them? They're not dead. They're hiding." A human child named Billy Parker met one of their ambassadors at a diplomatic function. The ambassador was 800,000 years old, one of the wisest beings in the universe. Billy Parker asked it, why? Thomas waited for more. "That's it?" "He asked why." "He asked why 47 times in a row," Rachel said. "Why do you exist? Why do you breathe? Why is space black? Why do stars burn? Why is there something instead of nothing? Why is there something instead of nothing?" The ambassador tried to answer each question, but every answer led to more questions. The elder races share a psychic network similar to the Void Reapers. Billy's questions spread to every elder being in the galaxy simultaneously. She pulled up another file. They've been trying to answer those questions for 3,000 years. Their entire civilization has devoted itself to finding the answers. They can't interact with the rest of the galaxy until they do. A 5-year-old child asked why and broke an immortal super civilization. Thomas felt like the floor was tilting beneath his feet. Everything he thought he knew about humanity was changing. They weren't just a young species struggling to find their place in the galaxy. They were something else entirely. something that even the oldest and most powerful beings in the universe feared. Why didn't anyone tell us this? He asked. Why doesn't Earth know its own history? Rachel shook her head. The records were sealed. After the Devour incident, the Galactic Council decided that humans were too dangerous to be left unsupervised. But they couldn't fight us. Every species that had tried to control or contain humanity had failed. So they did the only thing they could. What? They gave us a seat on the council. They made us part of the galactic community. They hoped that if we were included, if we felt like we belonged, we would be less likely to accidentally destroy everyone else with our friendship. Thomas laughed again, and this time there was real humor in it. We're so dangerous that they had to make us feel welcome to stop us from being dangerous. Exactly, Rachel said. And it's worked, mostly. Humans have spent the last 300 years being polite and curious and friendly. We've made friends with hundreds of species. We've shared our culture and learned theirs. We've been exactly what the council hoped we would be. But every now and then, someone forgets. Someone decides to test the humans. To see if the old stories are really true. Rachel's voice dropped. Sir, do you remember the incident on Station Gamma 7 last year? The one where the trade delegation from the Crimson Empire threatened to destroy Earth if we didn't give them access to our manufacturing technology? Thomas remembered. It had been a tense few weeks. The Crimson Empire was a powerful military force, and they had seemed serious about their threats. Then, suddenly, they had withdrawn all demands and issued a formal apology. What happened? Thomas asked. I never found out why they backed down. Rachel showed him one more file. It was a video recording from inside the Crimson Empire's command ship. The Emperor himself, a massive creature covered in red scales and golden armor, was sitting in his throne room. Opposite him sat a human woman in her 60s. She had gray hair and wore a simple blue dress. She was holding a casserole dish. That's my grandmother, Thomas said slowly. Elizabeth Blake. She died 2 years ago. She visited the Emperor, Rachel said. Alone, without weapons, without guards. She brought a casserole and a very firm letter about his attitude. She stayed for 3 hours. When she left, the Emperor had agreed to drop all demands, apologize to Earth, and sign a peace treaty that gave us favorable trade terms for the next 100 years. The video showed the Emperor, one of the most feared warlords in the galaxy, actually bowing to Thomas's grandmother as she left. He looked confused and slightly ashamed, like a child who had been scolded. She did what Grandma Maggie did, Thomas whispered. She just talked to him. She did what all humans do, Rachel said. She treated a monster like a person. She wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't impressed by him. She just saw someone who was behaving badly and decided to set him straight. Thomas looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, civilizations rose and fell. Wars were fought. Empires expanded and collapsed. And through it all, humanity wandered the galaxy with their casseroles and their questions and their stubborn refusal to be afraid of anything. We're not warriors, Thomas said quietly. We're not conquerors. We're what? Therapists? Parents? We're humans, Rachel said. We see something scary and we want to understand it. We see something hurting and we want to help it. We don't know how to leave things alone. We can't help but care. And that's terrifying. That's the most terrifying thing in the universe, Rachel agreed. Because you can fight an army. You can resist a weapon. But how do you defend yourself against someone who just wants to be your friend? Thomas thought about his great-great-grandmother Margaret feeding pot roast to a monster. He thought about his grandmother Elizabeth bringing casseroles to emperors. He thought about Dave Richardson and Billy Parker and all the other humans who had accidentally defeated cosmic threats with nothing but kindness and curiosity. He smiled. I think, he said, I need to have a very long conversation with the Galactic Council. They've been afraid of us for 300 years. Maybe it's time to show them that they don't have to be." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "How are you going to do that?" Thomas's smile widened. "I'm going to offer to buy them coffee. And then I'm going to ask them how they're feeling." Rachel stared at him. Then she started to laugh. Somewhere in the galaxy, ancient beings shivered without knowing why. Another human had decided to make friends. And nothing would ever be the same again. The Galactic Council reconvened 3 hours after the Forbidden Archive was opened. The Great Hall was quieter now. Many species had not returned. They had fled to their ships and their homeworlds, too frightened to stay near the human ambassador after learning the truth about his species. Those who remained watched Thomas Blake with a mixture of fear and fascination. He walked to the center of the hall with his hands at his sides and his head held high. Rachel Torres followed close behind, carrying her tablet filled with evidence of humanity's accidental conquests. Vaughn stood at his place among the elder representatives. His crystalline body had stopped shaking, but there was still a tremor in his voice when he spoke. "Ambassador Blake," Vaughn said, "you have seen the archives. You understand now why your species is feared. What do you have to say?" Thomas looked around the great hall. He saw thousands of alien faces, each one different from the last. Some had scales. Some had feathers. Some had no faces at all, just masses of light or shadow or sound. They came from every corner of the galaxy, from worlds so distant that light took millions of years to travel between them. And they were all afraid of a grandmother with a pot roast. "I understand," Thomas said slowly, "that you fear us. And I understand why. Humanity has done things that seem impossible. We have broken threats that no one else could defeat. We have changed species that had been the same for millions of years." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But I want you to understand something in return. We didn't do these things on purpose. My great-great-grandmother didn't plan to defeat the Devourers. She just saw someone who was hurting and wanted to help. Dave Richardson didn't try to destroy the Void Reapers. He just thought they needed to laugh. Billy Parker didn't mean to break the elder races. He was just curious." Vaughn made a sound like glass scraping against glass. "That is what makes you so terrifying, Ambassador. You do not try to be dangerous. You simply are. Your kindness is a weapon you did not even know you were holding." Thomas nodded. "Maybe. But that doesn't mean we want to hurt anyone. We don't want to be feared. We want to be friends." A ripple of movement passed through the hall. Species whispered to each other in languages that Thomas could not understand. Some of them seemed confused. Others seemed even more afraid than before. A representative from a species called the Stone Singers rose from her seat. She was tall and gray, her body carved from living rock. Her voice echoed through the hall like thunder in a canyon. "Friends?" she said. "How can we be friends with a species that breaks everything it touches? Your friendship changed the Devourers from conquerors to pacifists. Your friendship destroyed the Void Reaper's entire religion. Your friendship trapped the elder races in an eternal question. How do we know your friendship won't destroy us as well?" Thomas thought about the question. It was a fair one. Humanity did seem to change everything they encountered. But was that change really destruction, or was it something else? "Let me ask you something," Thomas said. "Before humanity arrived, what was the galaxy like?" The Stone Singer hesitated. "It was orderly, efficient. Each species had its place. Wars were fought according to ancient rules. The strong consumed the weak. The weak served the strong. That was the way of things. And now?" Vaughn answered. "Now everything is different. Species that were enemies for millions of years have formed alliances. The hegemony's war fleet has been converted into a culinary academy because human cooking was more satisfying than conquest. The predator guilds have started adopting pets because humans showed them that small creatures could provide emotional comfort. Even the Void Reaper's survivors have formed something called a comedy club. Thomas smiled. So humanity changed the galaxy. But did we make it worse? Silence fell over the hall. The representatives looked at each other, searching for an answer. Some of them seemed uncomfortable. Others seemed thoughtful. Rachel stepped forward with her tablet. "I've been looking at the statistics," she said. "In the 300 years since humanity joined the Galactic Council, the number of wars has decreased by 78%. The number of species going extinct has dropped by 90%. Average life expectancy across all species has increased by 34%. Trade between former enemies has quadrupled." She looked up at the assembled representatives. "The galaxy is more peaceful, more prosperous, and more connected than it has ever been in recorded history. And it happened because humans showed you a different way to live." The stone singer shook her massive head. "But we did not choose this. We did not ask to be changed." "No," Thomas agreed. "You didn't, and I'm sorry for that. Humans don't always think before we act. We see a problem and we try to fix it. We see someone hurting and we try to help. We don't always ask if our help is wanted." He took a deep breath. "But I'm asking now. I'm asking all of you. Do you want us to stop? Do you want us to pull back? To isolate ourselves? To stay away from the rest of the galaxy? We can do that. We can leave you alone. We can let you go back to the way things were." The hall was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, a voice rose from the back. It belonged to a species Thomas did not recognize, a small creature made of living flame that floated above its seat. "No," the creature said. "I do not want you to leave. Before humans came, my species was at war with our neighbors for 1,000 years. A human merchant stopped at our world and taught us to play something called poker. We now have a weekly game with our former enemies. We talk, we laugh, we share drinks and stories. It is better than war." Another voice joined in, then another and another. Representatives from dozens of species began sharing their own stories. Humans who had helped them find peace. Humans who had shown them joy. Humans who had changed their lives not through force, but through simple kindness. The stone singer listened to all of it. When the voices finally quieted, she turned back to Thomas. "You are still terrifying," she said. "Your kindness still spreads like a virus. Your hope still corrupts everything it touches. But perhaps—" She paused, her stone face cracking into something that might have been a smile. "Perhaps corruption is not always bad." Vorn stepped forward. His crystalline body was glowing with a soft light. "Ambassador Blake," he said, "I have lived for 12,000 years. I have seen empires rise and fall. I have watched species destroy each other over resources and pride and fear. In all that time, I never imagined that the galaxy could be changed by kindness." He extended one crystalline hand toward Thomas. "You asked if we want to be friends. I do not know how to answer that question. Friendship is still strange to me, but I am willing to learn. If you are willing to teach." Thomas looked at the offered hand. He thought about his great-great-grandmother Margaret, who had extended the same kind of invitation to a monster that devoured worlds. He thought about all the humans who had reached out to aliens with nothing but curiosity and goodwill. He thought about the power of a simple gesture. He took Vorn's hand. "I would be honored," Thomas said. "And Vorn, if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." Vorn's crystal body flickered. Is this how it starts? The change? The corruption?" Thomas smiled. "We call it friendship. And yes, this is how it starts." Across the Great Hall, species watched as a human and a 12,000-year-old crystal being shook hands. Some of them felt fear. Some felt hope. All of them felt something shifting in the universe, something fundamental and irreversible. Humanity had done it again, without weapons, without violence, without even trying. They had reached out with kindness, and the galaxy had no choice but to reach back. In the Forbidden's archive, a clerk made a notation in Margaret Well's file. The old warning still stood. Class Omega threat. Uncontainable. Do not engage. Do not resist. But now there was a new line beneath it. Accept the casserole. And somewhere far away, in the void between galaxies, the Devour Hive Queen called Vicky sat in the darkness. It was no longer hungry. It no longer consumed. Instead, it spent its days remembering a warm kitchen and a kind old woman who had asked it what was wrong. Sometimes, when it was feeling lonely, it would reach out across the stars. And Margaret Well's descendants would answer. They always answered. Because that was what humans did. They cared. And the universe was better for it.